Income Tax 2020, Tax Law and Authority. Come in, relax with Income Tax 2020. Tax law and authority. From a practical standpoint, we want to know what the tax law is and where we should go if we have questions. So if we have questions, we want to know where to go to answer those questions, the resources that we should be using, and the hierarchy of those resources so that if there is a conflict between the resources, we can know which one to adhere to and we know which ones to basically go to first when looking for our answers. We're going to be covering here and looking at statutory sources, administrative sources, judicial sources. Before we do so, however, just want to point out that, again, from a practical standpoint, it will depend on the complexity of your return oftentimes when you're thinking about how far you're going to have to dig into different types of resources to get your answers. In other words, if you're doing more simple or basic returns or lower income returns typically, then it's usually going to be fairly straightforward. There's usually not going to be a debate or argument about the tax law. If you're talking about something like a W-2 income and entering the W-2 income, it's fairly straightforward. It's not something that's currently in debate. There's not a whole lot of gray area in those areas, and therefore you can go to resources such as basically instructions in order to get answers for those type of things. So for example, if you have questions about things that are going to be fairly straightforward, this is the 2019 instructions for the Form 1040. We don't have the 2020 yet, so we're just looking at the 2019 just for an example. But these will give you kind of line-by-line instructions for basically filling out the Form 1040 and general instructions. Now, this is not the tax law right here. This isn't actually the tax code. These are resources put together by the IRS basically based on the tax code. But because we're typically dealing with things here for many of the basic returns that are not really in question, they're things that are fairly standardized. They're not things that have a gray area in it. If you're looking for how to do something, how to fill out the return, then you're typically going to go to resources such as this. You're going to look at the form that will be applicable. You'll take a look at the resources, the instructions that have been put together by the IRS to construct those forms. Now, if you have questions about something as to whether it is taxable or not, should it be included in income or should it not? Obviously, again, if you're talking about something like W-2 income, then it's pretty cut and dry. It's fairly standardized at that point in time. You don't need to dig too deep to figure that out. But if you're looking at some other income sources that might be more questionable, and you're saying, hey, I'm not sure if this is something that should be added in income, or I'm not sure if this is something that could be, for example, deducted as a medical expense or not, then you may not be able to get those types of answers directly from the instructions of a form like 1040, or possibly not even from the tax code itself. You might have to dive deeper and see if there's any precedent that has happened before, or if there's any other kind of rulings on this. So, and that would mean, again, if you're doing more basic returns, then usually what you would be doing is focusing in on volume if you're a tax preparer, right? You'd be doing larger volume returns, smaller profit margin, but more returns, and hopefully they would be more straightforward. You're not going to be doing a whole lot of research digging on past basically instructions for the forms, because all the information on them will be fairly straightforward. If you're doing more complex returns and you're talking about people who are more wealthy individuals that not everything's going to be driven by basically a W-2 or a 1099 or whatnot, forms that are fairly well standardized, then you're going to run into these areas where you might have the gray area oftentimes, such as, for example, the things like deducting medical expenses, and you have a weird medical expense on there, and you're kind of thinking about whether or not that can be deductible. Then you might go beyond basically, obviously, the instructions here, and then have to go into the law. So these resources here are basically kind of how-to. You can think of them more of a how-to rather than the law, including what should you do. In other words, if you're talking about income sources, the Form 1040 instructions basically say how to, enter the income, and probably touch on a little bit of what would be included in income. And then if you go to the law, which would be like the code over here, which you can check out by basically going to the irs.gov website, tapping in tax code regulations and so on. And then you're looking at the actual tax code, and this is the thing that basically is the primary resource that things are going to be based off on. This is the actual law here that the other resources will be built on. So that's just kind of a practical component here. So we're going to be considering here the statutory resources, the administrative resources, the judicial resources. Now, the statutory resources will include like the law here. And if it's in the law, if it basically says in the law that this is what it is, then that's it. Basically, you're pretty much done there. So that's going to be the hierarchy that we'll look at. But sometimes it won't. Sometimes you'll look into the law and you say, hey, this is still a kind of a gray area. Like this medical expense, for example, kind of fits into what would be determined as deductible, but maybe not, right? And so it could have a personal or business or medical and personal component to it or something. And then you might have to go into further. There might be administrative resources, sources then that have touched in on that. So then you can look at those resources. Now, if the administrative resources tend to conflict with the law, then you'd go to the law, right? So, for example, if they made an administrative resource saying one thing, and then Congress changed the law, the statutory law later, and now the law is now changed, well, the law would then be primary, and whatever administrative source had been built based on the law in the past would now be superseded by the law, which actually addresses it directly. And then if you can't find it in the statutory sources or administrative, then you have the judicial sources typically, and that would be basically like going to court cases. And these are things if you watch like law programs or whatnot, and when people, crime programs and whatnot, and they're going back to precedent in the court cases, there's a similar process with the tax law here. So you'd be saying, okay, I have this thing, I think it's going to be, it looks like it might be deductible. It's not clear in the law here. I don't see anything addressing it in the administrative sources. I'm going to see if there's precedent for people deducting something similar to this in the past that I think can be applicable to me. And then you can run with it at that point in time. The IRS then could question it, possibly, maybe they audit it, and you'd present them your precedent, and you'd say, hey, look, this is what I did here. And then you could go from there. And that's how, court cases could proceed forward in that way. And the court cases in and of themselves will have a precedent. So first we have the statutory source, and that's going to be the Internal Revenue Code itself and the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, which obviously allows for the federal taxation of individuals. So then we have basically the law. Again, the code is the first place you're going to go to. So if you have a question, you go to the code. Again, usually with basic things, like you're usually oftentimes just asking about where do I enter this on the tax return. Well, then you can go to the instructions, right? Because you're not really asking a question about whether or not it should be included in income or is it a deductible expense. You're asking, how do I do this? And that's going to be on oftentimes instructions. But if you have a question about, is this included in income because it's in a more of a gray area, or is this a deductible item, then the first place, the primary source would be then the law itself. And again, you can look at the law. It's laid out here, and look at the table of contents and go to the law. And you can find this by going to irs.gov, tax code regulations, and then go to the table of contents here. Within the table of contents, we're looking at income taxes. So that's going to be sections 1 through 1564. So we're going to go into then the income taxes. We're then going to be looking at the normal taxes and surtaxes typically. So normal taxes, surtaxes. And then we have computation of taxable income. So I'm going to go into the computation of taxable income. And then we got our definition of gross income, items specifically included in gross income, items specifically excluded from gross income, deductions for personal exemptions, itemized deductions, right? And you can see these are the code sections, and it's kind of walking along to our accounting equation here, right? So our tax equation. We've got the income, adjustments to income, and so on and so forth. So if you wanted to actually look at the code and see how it's laid out, you can do that. Obviously, it's going to be in legalese. You're going to have to, work around with it, but you can get an idea of the sections that will then apply, and that can give you kind of an outline if you were to go into kind of more the legal side of things to look that up. So then we have the administrative sources, which include Treasury regulations, revenue rulings, revenue procedures, private letter rulings, and IRS notices. And these are often used for the IRS to basically say, hey, look, this is something that isn't possibly addressed directly within the code. Maybe there was questions about this thing or another, and the law is coming out and putting these resources out there. Now, if these resources in your mind, of course, or if you believe these resources are in contrast to what the code says, then the code then would be taking precedent right here. So you could say that I'm argue against basically these resources and say that it's contradicting the code, which is going to be primary. But obviously, generally what you would be saying is this is what the code says, and then I'm going to move on to these other resources, typically being in alignment with these other administrative resources. And then again, if it's not covered there, you typically go then to the judicial resources, tax court, U.S. District Court, U.S. Court of Federal Claims. And then the court cases can basically help to provide precedent, just as they do in other kind of court cases that you probably take a look at, criminal shows or something like that, where they're going to refer to a court case, which is going to give precedent in a situation that isn't addressed directly by the law. Similar kind of thing can happen here. I have this deduction. It's not addressed specifically by the law. I think it can be interpreted this way. I interpreted it that way. IRS takes the opposite position because they don't like the deduction, and then it's going to be hashed out in court. When it is hashed out in court, then there's a precedent. So once there's a precedent, then that precedent might stand and might be used to do a similar thing in the future. And if the court or if the law doesn't like that, then they can create a law which would then close up that problem or address it and possibly change the outcome, which would make that case, that precedent no longer applicable if the law was specifically countering it after that point in time. So that's going to basically be the hierarchy. So it's good to have that kind of hierarchy in your mind when you're making the tax returns. You're saying, first off, usually, here's a certain situation. If it's a question about how to do something, then you're typically going to go to the instructions. How do I enter this into the tax return? If it's a question about should this be included in income or deductions, and it's not addressed in basically instructions and whatnot, it's a little outside the box, then you got to go say, okay, I'm going to go to the law, and then I'm going to go to some of these other resources to determine whether or not I can move forward with it, whether I should include it in income, whether I should deduct it.